Hey, hi. Thank you. We're going to start. Wow, what a fantastic turnout. I think we've almost got you in here. Welcome to Format. My name is Shuman Basar. Thanks so much for coming to the beginning of this year's issue, this series. Thanks to my guests. To my right, Sam Jacob and Martino Gamper. More about them in a minute. Thanks to Wayne Daly, who produced the really fantastic handout that hopefully all of you have seen. And also this beautiful poster, which is available for all of you. What? Not for everyone. We'll have to figure out a system.
You could just tear it up, though, couldn't you?
You could tear it up.
Well, I'd say that.
Everyone gets a letter each.
Yeah, we got 4 times career.
Yeah.
Can you please all turn your phones to silent at this point? Thank you very much. If there's any possible way of squeezing further down, that would be great. There's just a few other people at the door I can see.
One more seat here.
Well, there's someone over there. So I don't know if the back row could just squeeze one more. That would be great. We'll get someone.
You can sit on top of that kind of chair.
There's a little patch over here.
There's a chair there. And there's a chair there.
There's even a chair. There's a throne over here. Sir, the throne is yours. I see you have a nice mask as well. You are Le Caboose. No, who is that? Huh? Levi Strauss is in the house. Levi Strauss gets a chair. There you go, Levi.
Okay.
Special guest, Levi Strauss. Okay.
Is his birthday?
Oh, yeah. Are they?
Now you've not only got the phone,
Oh, but now he's got the fan as well. It really is the best thing.
Oh, put it up. Sorry. Thanks.
Is that on 3?
On 2.
Should we go to 3?
Yeah, maybe up. So. Good.
I'd say take it to 4.
Take it to 4. Is it better fixed, or do you want it spinning?
Let's have everyone a bit of fresh air.
Can you pull the thing at the top? Yeah.
Is it okay?
Great. Okay. I think that's as good as we're gonna get. Well done. Thank you for your cooperation. Okay, let's get going. So, Samuel Beckett once said about James Joyce's work in progress that form is content and content is form. A few decades later, and Marshall McLuhan declared that the medium is the massage. Inspired by these words, format is about the shapes that knowledge takes. What is the grammar of how we know or feel things? And if there's a hidden politics to presentation, what might they be? This is the 5th issue, the 5th annual issue of Format, and I think of it as a live magazine. And so these are some of the formats that we've looked at over the past few issues, and I decided this year, instead of picking a noun, like essay or chat show or spam, these formats will focus on one particular, one single idea, which is that of career format. Over the last few years, having read and listened to many interviews with people that I and perhaps even you also will admire from different fields, whether it's fashion or art or filmmaking, I began to notice that almost all of these people refuse to describe their lives using the word career. And so from the privileged vantage point of looking back over decades, so as I say, often these are personalities who have become successful, whose bodies of work are 20, 30, 40 years long. So from this particular vantage point of being able to look back, they preferred instead to mythologize their personal roots using much less deterministic language. Instead, you'd hear them use curiosity or chance or serendipity. And of course, they would speak very, very often about failures that turn into kinds of naive successes much, much later on in completely unpredictable ways. So the question I wanted to pose and explore over the next couple of weeks is, what are they rejecting when they reject the word career? And if the design of one's own persona is perhaps the very first work that any creative career requires, can't we also picture the narrative or intentional or unintentional decisions that one makes? Can't we also picture this as a kind of design or a story or an artwork? When you're starting out, do you look to the shapes and sensibilities of previous protagonists in your field or elsewhere? Not for what they produce. That would be the obvious thing, that we would look to other people, to our precedents. Not for what they produce, but for how they maneuvered through space and time, opportunity and adversity. So it's a kind of attitude or an approach or a sort of acrobatics even through these different forces that somehow act upon you when you choose to do something. So to explore this, I'm inviting a number of notable guests, all of whom have forged idiosyncratic lives in their own right. I then asked each of them to bring along one career format from someone in their own discipline, and then also one career format not from their own discipline. Together, we, and hopefully that includes you as well, will try and discern whether there are patterns or if there are actually only ever exceptions. Inspiration is a word almost devoid of meaning today. It's been bludgeoned over the head by advertising, self-help, etc. But I hope we're able to rediscover its original meaning and impact during these sessions. So first, a few words about our first guest, Martino Gamper. Martino started as an apprentice with a furniture maker in Murano, and then went on to study sculpture under the great Michelangelo Pistoletto. And then he moved to London and completed a master's at the Royal College of Art under Ron Arrad's tutelage, and then went on to teach with Ron Arad later, also at the RCA. I've known Martino for about 15 years now. He has a kind of militantly collaborative approach, and I think that's one of the things that marks him out, perhaps from many of his contemporaries, but also, as well as being an incredibly inventive and interesting designer of things, many of those things are furniture pieces. He's also an organizer or a designer of situations, one of which is a thing called the trattoria, which he did with Maki Suzuki, Obek, and a number of other people over a number of years. And this brought together food and people, design and place, again into a kind of very special and quite precious series of situations. In 2014, the Serpentine Gallery hosted a solo exhibition of Martino's work, and it's touring internationally. It's in Bolzano at the moment. And around this exhibition, Martino said, "There is no perfect design, and there is no uber design. Objects talk to us personally. Some might be more functional than others, and the emotional attachment is very individual." Will you please join me in welcoming Martino Gamper? Thank you.
Thanks, Shimon. Thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, career. I never actually thought about a career until I got the email from Shimon. Because the way it is, before you know, so for a long time you don't know what you want to do. So you kind of go to school, you go to university, and you try to find out what you're going to do. Eventually you go to college, and by the time you get out of college, you know even less what you're going to do. And then you do all kinds of jobs to survive, to get on, and you kind of have this idea that you're looking for something, not quite sure what. Eventually, you have success in whatever you do, hopefully, and by that time, I think you totally absorbed in work, and I think you never actually have time to look back really and say, well, actually, I have a career. There is a career path. So it was an interesting one when the email came. It's like, oh, of course, I've got a career, but I don't know, not quite sure.
You've only just realised.
I only just realised I have a career, yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Your parents must be very proud.
Yeah. So as Schumann said, I entered the professional world at a very young age, and I was 14 years old. Did an apprenticeship. And interesting dual education system where you go, you work at the master's atelier, but you also go to school once a week, so you're not completely out of school. That enables you to do, after 5 years, to do an exam, and that exam enables you to go into higher education. So I did the reverse thing of first working and then going into college or university.
Was that was your decision?
That was my decision. Also, my teachers kind of slight suggestion I shouldn't go into higher education because I wasn't particularly could I put it? I wasn't interested basically in school. I was too distracted by too many other things. But I had a great kind of urge to use my hands, and up to today, I use my hands every day making things, and yeah.
And
so,
was that, sorry, I'm interested in whether your parents had any role in the decisions you made.
They were happy I was out of trouble in a way, because in school I was just an annoyance to everyone else. I don't know. Troublemaker, but because I was bored rather than I wanted to make trouble. So they were happy I had something to do, and yeah.
But was this the notion of doing an apprenticeship here? That feels like from another age almost. Was that something?
It's quite common. Yeah, it's still alive. Now it's not 14. Now it's 16. The age of 16. It's still very much alive. Yeah, and it's pushed a lot in the last 10 years to get young people back into vocational kind of training and continuing kind of doing certain crafts and so on. So it's probably a very Italian thing to have. That you actually after school you start a job by doing an apprenticeship. So for me, looking kind of back and looking at the people that I really admired for their work, it was George Nakashima somehow. Even before I kind of knew what actually design was, when I've seen his work somewhere, and I was really fascinated by someone who was a maker but was also a designer. So he wasn't just a maker who would make other people's work, other people's drawings. He would come up with his own design. And he very much kind of did what he really wanted to do. So he wasn't like working for the industry. He really wanted to make beautiful pieces of furniture with his own hands and in his own time. And at that time I didn't quite understand that how you would get to that, how can you design something? How would the thinking and the making relate to each other? It came a lot later that the two came together for myself.
Do you remember how old you were when you
it was actually in college. It was actually when I was in Vienna University somehow. I thought, there is the making, but I can also leave the making aside and think and draw and design, and then with the knowledge I have, I can make something. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something I'm still very much interested in my practice, to have the thinking and have the making, and that enables me to work between those two sides. And very difficult to do two things at the same time: the thinking and the making. Feels like it's two parts of the brain that I don't know, are meant to be separate, or. But yeah. So for me it was George Nakashima in a way, and 3 years ago I went to see his one of his studios in Japan, and not only was I really excited to see how they work there, but also to see the material, all this amazing wood, all this amazing timber there that was like unique pieces somehow, and also to see how his setup was, how because I have a workshop as well in my studio, and I was interested how does someone work, in a similar career as a maker and a designer, and yeah. I think that's something in general I'm very interested in. How do we, first of all, how do we get to what we do, but also what is our surrounding? What do we need to work? And I guess as a designer, I think probably nobody really talks about this, but I think we design very much our own profession, our own job. And I think that's something that I noticed when I came out of the Royal College, that I had to take in kind of an active kind of decision to design my own practice. Otherwise, I would just follow someone else's kind of path, and I would probably do the similar work. So what you described earlier on, the collaborations and the creating situations, creating spaces and places, and it was very much a decision to make this part of my practice, and to design parts of it rather than just the objects. You also design your own practice.
So that was a very conscious thing.
Yeah, I was trying to find a new model as well, because coming from Italy, you look back at all those masters. Most of them were architects. Most of the Italian designers that we know, from Ponti to Albini to Castiglioni, they're all architects. They were trained as architects. So, and they did design because there wasn't much work out there as architects in many cases, or less work. So they kind of became designers, kind of by chance, or by need. So they were somehow interesting to me, but I realized that they came from a different approach, and it was very much working for the industry. And while graduating from the Royal College of Art, London in 2000 was a different place. There was hardly any industry. There was hardly an industry in the country. So if there's no industry, who are you going to work with? So I had to somehow find my own industry, or create my own industry. Mm-hmm. So that's. But I think.
What's that? Sorry to interrupt, but I was wondering whether at the. The Royal College of Art has had a long history, and each of its departments have histories within those. But when one thinks particularly of product design or those sort of object-oriented design departments at the Royal College, one thinks that one of the advantages that the Royal College has is its very strong links to industry, and that part of one's privilege of being there is that you make these relationships, and that once you graduate, you're able to, you're not just left out in the void, as it were, but you have somewhere or places to at least have conversations with. Is that, was the notion of what happened after you graduated, was that something, a conversation that was alive during your studying at the Royal College, or?
Yeah, I think we all look back at at other graduates, what they did, what kind of path they took, and I think there's probably less connections in industry. It was more connection within the community that graduated or was around that thing, and I think it's still very much that I work with people that somehow came from this environment. So I guess the AA is a similar world, where people graduating. Opening studios together, people move on, they get different positions, So I guess it was more the people within the different kind of years and that somehow created an environment.
Mm-hmm. Like almost the momentum.
Mm. And you learn, you also learn, you see other people, the mistakes of other people. Like, okay, well, his career went that way, I want to do slightly different, I don't want to end up like him or her. Mm-hmm. And I think I guess that's a continuous, wheel. Like, I'm sure there's many graduates out there who think like, I don't want to end up like Martino, and that's that's fair enough.
But who didn't you want to be?
Yeah.
Who did I want to be?
You have to name names.
No,
It only works
no,
if you name names.
I didn't want to do the work that, for example, Michael Marriott did, even though we both come from a making background and we're very good friends. But I always wondered why, in certain point of his career, he didn't emphasize more certain work. And for example, he kind of, at least from my perspective, but probably his perspective is very different. He's got a very different explanation of that.
And can you say something about George Nakashima in relation to, you said a lot of the Italian designers that we know very well were architects. Was Nakashima, does he fit in that category as well?
No, he actually came from more from making a sculpture. He was a friend of Noguchi and so on, and he obviously from Japan he emigrated to America after the war, and actually back again. So did to America and back to Japan. So he was more of a sculptor in a way, and I think in that sense, he really wanted to work with his hands and create one-off objects. And of course, Italian designers work for the industry; they wanted to create as many products as they could. But also for me, it was more the approach of maybe that generation of Italian architects that, they work very much from a paper, white piece of paper.
Yeah.
They were really good draftsmen, so they would start designing ideas, sketching idea. Go to companies, show it, and say, okay, you like this? And I think for me, this was somehow something that I didn't feel like mine, I really wanted to make things and try them out myself and learn through that process. And then maybe at one point you end up going to a company, the company comes to you and you show them this, and also more experimental in a way, Again, mixing different parts like furniture and food, or other kind of fields together, and rather than you design something, you hope to get a royalty, and with the royalty then you go to a restaurant and spend the money there. So so that's how the Trattoria somehow came out with me, Maki, Kaiser, and Alex. That we thought like, well, why do we have to earn money and then go to the restaurant and spend the money? We might as well create our own restaurant, so we can invite our friends and eat the food that we really like, and we really, the environment we really like to be, and it can be different each time.
Yeah.
So that was somehow behind this as well, like looking also beyond in a way what just the product is and what this piece kind of does in the world, maybe the social economic part,
Well, there's a notion of economy there as well.
Yeah, there's also a notion.
That's not just monetary.
Yeah.
It's of course social. It's also symbolic, and I guess it's professional as well in the sense that obviously many of us work in environments where the line between the social and work is probably not a line at all, right? Yeah. So, I always felt the Trattoria was part of that as well. It was without the ugliness of the word networking or all of that kind of very explicit stuff, but still, again, when you're starting out, what you don't have is money, but perhaps what you do have is curiosity and the willingness to try things out. And that can only really happen if you meet other people.
Sure.
Right? So, do you have some other things?
Well, that's more the interior in a way. That's actually his house that he built as well. So actually, it's funny enough, he became an architect. So he actually designed his own house at the end of the day. So from the making to furniture, he then made his own house. So rather than the architect becomes the designer, the designer maker, and it becomes an architect.
When was he at his most active?
In the late 70s, all throughout the 70s, He moved then to Pennsylvania, and kind of through his friends, he got this big plot of land where he built his studio in his house. And and even nowadays they're still making the furniture, so they're still made by his daughter on his designs, and they're still made the same way, so they're still continuous. And in Japan, there's a small workshop where they make him a license, but again, he set up the workshop. It feels like just probably a copy of the workshop in Pennsylvania. I haven't been to the one in Pennsylvania yet, but we would like to go. And also what I like about it, that he's really been one of those people who, maybe come back, a lot of furniture design, a lot of makers in a way, try to unify and make things really the same. But because he uses single bits of timber, each piece becomes a unique piece. And that's something that in my work, my practice, I do a lot. I make a lot of unique pieces, one-off pieces, that for me have equally enough importance than making something that gets manufactured. And yeah, so for me, that's working for industry or working on studio on a single piece. For me, it's got the same importance somehow.
I'm just going to show a few images from, I think, one of your really well-known and also well-loved projects, which is 100 chairs.
In 100 days.
In 100 days. Could you say something about how the project started and how it then evolved? Because there are interesting links, I think, also to Nakashima.
So again, as I said before, the paper wasn't mine. I wasn't maybe the best kind of drawer, but I could use my hand in other ways. So I realized that I was much quicker in making the chairs rather than draw them. So make a drawing and then translate. So the drawing is already translation. So then the translation back to a piece and back and forth. So I went straight to the making. So I didn't actually draw at all with the 100 chairs. And again, the necessity. I didn't have a lot of money. I had a small studio. I was trying to find a career. And what I could find was loads of chairs and found kind of bits of furniture on the streets of London. And so I collected hundreds and hundreds of them, and then eventually kind of set myself this 100 days. And for me, it was about, there's many different layers. It's about taking something existing apart, kind of morphology of trying to understand what other people have done, trying to learn from that. Because a lot of time, I think, as designers, we don't really actually know what other people have done. We know the images. We know his design history. Oh, this piece, this designer. But actually, when you see the real piece, it's a lot different a lot of times. The scale is different, the detailing, the material. Some of it's really made really badly, some of it's really sophisticated. And so it gave me a chance to take things apart or see why they broke and how they broke, how other people have fixed it maybe. And so it was a very three-dimensional sketching process where I had to be very fast. I didn't have too much time to make a decision. And that was kind of actually great relief and a great freedom again. Say, okay, well, I just have to get on. I'm going to do it now. And I think eventually I found my own method in that, And yeah, for me they were all individual characters. All those chairs were personalities. And yeah, one way also a small industrial production in its own way. So trying to find maybe one chair that could maybe make it into production.
There's one thing I find thinking about Nakashimi's work and these is the final form of each object. That some of it is controlled by you or by him, and then there's always an element that somehow isn't. That's either in your case found on the streets of London, or in his case somehow given by nature ultimately. But again, I'm interested. So chronologically, you knew about Nakashima before you?
Yes. So I've seen his work when I was 18 or 19, at the end of my apprenticeship. I've seen it in a book of a friend of mine. And but what I saw was, I don't know, I saw a different picture than I see now when I look at his work. I saw it purely from a carpentry point of view. How is it made? But I like the idea that someone kept the imperfection as well and worked with materials, because a lot of the time when I worked did my apprenticeship, everything was kind of perfect, too perfect. There was no room for improvisation. There was no room for mistakes or kind of imperfection. And I really liked it when I first saw it. I said, well, it's just a big blank of wood, beautiful piece of blank of wood. But then how he joins it and how he works with it, So that kind of caught my eye and kind of my interest. And only really much later, I got back to it and it's like, oh yeah, that guy.
Are there other things that you?
No, I think that's it. That's his house. I think also it's the wall piece. Yeah, I think maybe I would also like to build my own house one day.
The ultimate project.
Yeah.
And maybe you could introduce us to Christoph Keller.
Keller. So, hold on a second, we're getting too fast. So Christoph Keller was a graphic designer and a publisher. And he had a very successful magazine called Revolver Magazine. And he had a really big book collection that he toured around Europe called Beyond Kiosk. And it was books that he really, obviously collected, but he really really appreciated as a graphic designer. And it was about 700, 800 books. And I went to many different museums as a kind of open library. And every time he asked someone else to design the exhibition design. And I did one of those in Mudam in Luxembourg. That's why I actually got to know him. And about, I think a year, it was the same year or about a year later, he sold his business and sold his publishing company and gave the books away, the collection. And he moved to a very small place in southern Germany on Lake Constance. And he bought an old farmhouse and he became a distiller. So he got himself, that's probably not his first distilling kind of equipment. Let me see, there's a picture of him. I saw that a picture of him somewhere. Here, Christoph. And he became a distiller. But what was interesting for me is that he did it with the same rigor, with the same kind of passion that he did the publishing and the design. And within not many years, maybe 10 years, he became a master kind of distiller with amazing gin, amazing kind of schnapps, with amazing distills that are known all over the world in any kind of bar, maybe cocktail bar. So I think it kind of showed me that, as you said before, it's never too late to maybe change career as well. You know, sometimes you think, okay, you're going to continue on this, you found something, you found your career. But I actually think that creativity is transferable. You know, you don't necessarily have to be a furniture designer and stuck with it. I think we can change careers in a sense, and transfer the same ideas onto other fields and do other things. And something I guess I'm also thinking about sometimes. Thinking, okay, I've done a few chairs, I've done a few tables.
What would you fancy doing?
There's a lot of interest. I like wood, so I don't know, but it's not that different. I like wood. But I was thinking to become a wood turner, you know. But it's probably the same then.
You grow trees.
Yeah, grow trees, true. Yeah. I mean, you know, always had this kind of fantasy of opening a restaurant, but I guess after the trattoria thing, we all realized it's not a business to really get into. It's nice to cook for your friends, but every day, no way. I totally would this.
Explicit career advice: don't open a restaurant.
Don't open a restaurant.
Don't open a restaurant.
You don't have a life anymore.
So the thing about Christoph Keller is this: is basically this quite dramatic decision to give up.
Yeah.
In a way, at the height, because Revolver was doing extremely well.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's not like it was on its way down, and he pulled the parachute.
No.
It was like being number one in the charts and sort of deciding to give up and start something completely different.
Yeah.
And then becoming extremely good at that.
You know, he really learned. He really kind of he learned himself basically. you know. He autodidactic, you know. He didn't go and work for someone else who was a distiller, you know. He basically started experimenting and kind of figuring out how things work, you know, how to understand. And I asked him, so why, you know, why distilling? And he said, well, I guess 10 years ago, especially gin, when he started with gin, he realized that the whole industry was kind of run by a few big companies, you know, and only last 5 years it's become a big fashion to kind of gin. But he started like, you know, more than 10 years ago with his own gin, and kind of also started in a way a little hype, you know, with small patch kind of gin production. But it was kind of, the industry was run by a lot of big companies, you know, Gordon Gins or whatever you name it, you know, huge industries. And he realized that similar to publishing, you know, publishing world 20 years ago was a similar thing, that it was run by really big companies. And small publishers slowly started to kind of do smaller runs, because it was obviously with the help of the printing techniques and the computers, you could do a lot smaller kind of design things. So he kind of foreseen a little bit the development and saying, okay, well, there is a world that's totally not a lot of freedom to do your own thing as a small producer with, you know, very high quality. And I think also he said the slowness. He liked the slowness of it. You know, it takes years. It takes time. It's kind of.
It's also turning away from city life, right?
Yeah, I think it's probably also getting away from city life, and maybe also I think publishing world is a very hard world in the sense of, you know, it goes well with a few books, but if it doesn't go well, then you very quickly out of business as well. It's not necessarily a business to make money in.
Do you know if his distilling business become?
Yeah, it's very. I think
financially.
Yeah, it's very successful. It's very successful. I think he got many awards, and again, yeah. I mean, this monkey gin here is really well known in any bar in the world. You ask for monkey gin, and it's like, yeah. And I think it's nice because he's very experimenting. He does like distilleries with mushrooms. He distills mushrooms. He distills all kind of vegetables that you think like, wow, aubergines, you know, like, and other things. So yeah.
Great. We'll come back to some of this. I'd like to introduce. Sam, do you want to? Okay, your thing ready.
Can I put sound?
Yeah. So our next guest. Thanks so much to Martino. Our next guest is Sam Jacob. Sam writes and teaches about architecture, design, and culture for a number of magazines and institutions. Okay, sir? Such as the AA, the UIC in Chicago, and Yale University over in New Haven. Last year, he co-curated the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennial of Architecture. Here's a very dramatic image of you and Wouter in the middle of your institution. And very, very recently, he and his colleagues at VAT decided to bring their 20-year-long plus practice to a close, having been uniquely prominent figures, ascending from cult to, dare I say it, even the establishment in that relatively short time. Will you please join me in welcoming Sam Jacob?
Thank you, Shimon. It does feel like a bit like a career fair. You're also young, or like almost all of you are so young. So
who doesn't look young?
I think on the stage we're a bit haggard, aren't we? But it's an interesting thing to think about career, because it's a very unnatural thing. As like it's kind of been alluded to, careers only really make sense when you look at them backwards. Actually, they're just a whole load of things which happen, but they're unnatural things which actually I think, have a really strong kind of force on us as people as we try and make our lives. So you think of like climbing the career ladder. You think of the way you have to actually format yourself to ascend that ladder, how you have to build your CV and so on. And in fact, you think, actually, this is it's a kind of tyranny of the career. Like, I mean, maybe some people are lucky enough to escape from that. But for many of us, if you want to like engage with the world and, move on, get promoted, get paid more, have more responsibility, have more power, then you need to kind of give something up to the very idea of the unnaturalness of the career. But careers are funny things. It comes from the French word carrier, which means both road and race course, which is interesting. Think of it as a map and a race, and that actually is quite embedded in the way we think of careers. But also from the original Latin for wagon. It also sounds like careering, like you're out of control. And I think it's partly all of those things. But what I want to talk about tonight is not about building your career, but actually about how you take your own career apart. How you put the brakes on your wagon, how you put a roadblock in the road, how you stop, in other words. How you might need to design your demise. So I think it's true, and I think both Martino and Schumann have talked about it before. It's like one of the most important jobs as a designer is really to design yourself. And I've always thought that was really important. Like, before you can design anything else, a thing, a building, you have to imagine what you will be as a designer. And so that, in a sense, is a design project itself. But I've now come to think of a more important design project, which is to design your own demise. Now, this is important because that's actually the only moment where your career makes sense, is when it's over. Now, I think it's too important to leave to chance, like death. You might cross the road and get hit by a bus, and where would your career be then? So you need to take this in hand and deal with it in a much more creative way. And we know that there are people who have done this. So this is a very theatrical version of designing your own demise. So this is the theatrical figure of Ziggy Stardust, who is not a real person, is actually David Bowie, of course. And Ziggy Stardust has a song in which he talks about breaking up the band. And this is the film from the last tour of Ziggy. And when he announced that this would be the last concert, there was a sort of confusion. People didn't quite know if they meant Ziggy, the fictional character, or David Bowie, the real person. Which I think is kind of interesting that you can confuse the two. But of course it wasn't the real person. It was this fictional figure. But you can see how theatrical he's being, right? Now, I want to talk about another person who quit, another person from the music industry. So this is my real figure, it's not David Bowie. My real figure with a career from another industry is Johnny Rotten, a.k.a. John Lydon. Now, I think I'd probably better give you some context because you're all so young. Johnny Rotten was part of a band called the Sex Pistols, who were the sort of great English punk band from 1975, 1976. I think they split up in, about 3 years later, so a very short period of time. During that time, they did all kinds of things. They, swore on TV. This is the tabloid headlines that they generated. They went on a boat down the river on the day of the Queen's Jubilee as a sort of fuck you to the monarchy. And, of course, they wrote a whole load of amazing songs and caused chaos everywhere. It happened, it was a very short period of time, and it ended essentially like this. So they were taken on tour by their Svengali manager, or self-proclaimed Svengali manager, media manipulator Malcolm McLaren, and he took them on a tour of America. And it was a terrible tour. Everyone had a shit time. They were all arguing. No one was talking to each other. There was no money. And they eventually ended up on stage here in San Francisco. And this is their encore, where they play the Stooges' No Fun. Etc., etc. So he's just going, no fun, no fun, no fun, this is no fun. And then you can see him getting really pissed off, really like... So you could think of this as the cry of everybody who's in a career saying, actually, this is no fun. How can I escape the claustrophobia of this world that I've created? The CV that I've built around me. So this is how you do it. If you can find the right moment. They're still moaning about your job. They must be way at the end. And so with that, the most notorious figure in British pop at that moment drops the microphone, walks off the stage, and walks out of the Sex Pistols. And I think that's a very dramatic gesture of escaping the persona that one's created, a sort of necessary persona which was, about making a difference to the world, making a kind of the idea of the Sex Pistols real. But of course, when he's escaped that, he's escaped also being this imaginary version of himself, Johnny Rotten. In fact, he's not even allowed to use the name Johnny Rotten because apparently that's owned by somebody else. So he reverts to his own name, John Lydon, and returns in the form of Public Image Limited. And he says about his return that, I wanted to get away from attacking institutions, which was basically the job I'd allotted for myself when I joined the Pistols, and I just wanted to experiment inside my own head. You can't change the world if you don't change yourself first. So that was the ambition of it all. Very utopian in many ways, but that's basically how Pill works. So you could think of this really as a kind of quitting, as a sort of really utopian act of escaping the horrible world which you had to create in the first place into a certain kind of freedom. Of course, it's also about trying to own the story of your formation. Like, Churchill says, history is written by the victors. And in some senses, the battle over the Sex Pistols was part of their mythology, was who owned the story. Was it Johnny Rotten or was it Malcolm McLaren? This film, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, argues that it's Malcolm McLaren. Johnny Rotten will tell you a very different story. Of course, it also allows you to escape from other things. Eventually, you find him advertising Country Life butter. Is that a lot more fun, or is that no fun? I'm not sure. So my person from the world of architecture is also someone who has sort of refused to be an architect while being an architect. Someone who's a great friend and a very important figure in the AA and in the myth of the AA, and it's this man, Mr. David Greene, one of the founders of Archigram, who stapled together issue number 1 of Archigram with Peter Cook. Now, David is an architect, and he's been teaching, making work about architecture for 40, 50 years, longer probably. But his career is a very interesting one because really there's a certain kind of radicality to it, which is against buildings. And so I'm sure many of you know the sort of overall narrative story of Archigram, which was all about machines and robots and consumerism and plug-in cities and walking cities and big megastructures made out of like technology. But David represents a sort of another side of Archigram, which was actually one which believed even more in the possibilities of technology, but the possibilities of the technology to release us from the tyranny of architecture and also, I suppose, the tyranny of having to build buildings. And if you're an architect, the professionalism that you need in order to build your career is unbelievably stifling, which is part of the reason we at FAT decided to break up the band. So David's interest was always much more in things like gardening. So from Archigram 1 to Archigram 9, here it is, the Archigram gardening special, which came with a free packet of seeds. And this was all the image. I'm talking about David like he's dead. He's not. He's probably upstairs. This is always his sort of, image of what architecture is now, watching cricket on a portable TV while you're fishing in the landscape. And one of my favourite projects ever, which had a starring role in the Venice Biennale show that we did last year, and it was in the gallery here not so long ago, which is the log plug, which is a thing which looks like a log and just sits around in the landscape, but has power and data and basically a kind of servicing node that allows you to enjoy yourself and do stuff. So it's a sort of idea that you don't need architecture anymore, and perhaps you don't need architects, or certainly architects with proper careers. They might be the worst thing for the world. Here's a project which is a post-Archigram project which David worked on called City Crusher. And it's a really a work about how do you get rid of architecture. He found a machine called the City Crusher, which was used for crumbling up buildings and getting rid of them. And here is his calculations on how long you would need to rent this machine from Casa Verde Construction in Santa Monica in order to get rid of the Empire State Building. Basically, he says here, looks like we need the City Crusher for about a year, taking public holidays into account. So that's what you'd need in order to erase the solid architectural mass of the Empire State Building and release that land back into a world of possibility rather than dead fate. Here's a thing David also likes to sort of use weird bits of technology to communicate. This came through the post one day, a photocopy of him holding his old Nokia phone, the text saying, "Declare a moratorium on building." And in a sense, I think that's a very radical act for someone whose job is supposed to be an architect, supposed to be building. And what it's really saying is architecture is far more important than that. So David's biggest, perhaps most significant conceptual gesture was that he retired in the early 70s when still a young man. And so, in a way, just like Johnny Rotten walking off the stage at the height of his fame, for David to claim he's retired at the height of Archigram's fame, I think is equally such a gesture full of meaning that shows that not doing something, that ending something, that refusing to participate might be just as important, just as positive an act as all of us who carry on trying to be good citizens and improving our CVs and getting on in the world. So those are my two figures.
Thank you. Yes? So, similar questions, basic questions that I asked Martino to you too. When did you become aware of Johnny Rotten? When did he enter your mental career landscape?
That was all way before my time.
Yeah.
But it's such a strong myth in the sort of the pop culture of the 1980s and 90s, which I think we both grew up in within British sort of indie music culture. It was like the Sex Pistols are like kind of the degree zero. That is where the story of indie music comes from, and it's from there that you have the whole a whole world opens up. So it was like a received myth but seen through the stories of other bands and the importance that it had on, I guess, creating a certain very specific culture that was communicated through the pages of Melody Maker and late night John Peel radio, which did feel different. In those days, things did feel a bit different, a bit special, a bit separate, because it wasn't, everything wasn't on the internet all the time. So in order to access those things, it was very, you had to find the right, music magazine and listen to the right radio show at the right time. And so that made it feel like a more important, maybe, thing. Of course, now, that story is also part of the mainstream culture. It's, Q magazine every week has probably got a Sex Pistols Wonderland special, and wouldn't be surprised.
And David Greene, when did he enter your...
David Greene, well, I'd always known about Archigram as sort of from studying architecture, and always been excited about it. I got to know David when I was teaching at Westminster, and he was the professor at Westminster, and I was endlessly shocked by both his kind of generosity, his gentleness, and his pessimism, I have to say, as well, which is, I think, an important aspect, because architecture is such a kind of booster-ish culture. Every architect you meet tells you how brilliant they are and what an amazing project they're working on. They never say, I'm not very good, and the projects I'm doing at the moment, they really stink. But, so, when we were trying to borrow the log plug picture, David was like, why do you want this scrappy little drawing? It's probably the worst drawing there's ever been, ever drawn in architecture. It's like, we were like, well, David, come on, everyone loves that project. It's amazing, and there was that self-depreciation, which also didn't sit with the sort of personality, the sort of alpha personality that you expect of architects. It's far more self-depreciating, far more, I guess, English in a way, very sort of English attitude to a bit embarrassed about any success that he might have had, and never wanting to talk about that side of
But
things.
that needs a little bit of context as well. It's interesting you pick Johnny Rotten and not the Sex Pistols, and you pick David Greene and not Archigram, right? So, and in a way, I mean, the shorthand description of Archigram would have been the Beatles of architecture, right? Particularly during the 60s and the late 60s, right? So, but could you maybe say something about... Because I think the thing about Archigram, and also about the Sex Pistols as well, was they were much more than just any one individual. They were actually composite of a number of individuals, a number of characters. And could you say something about some of the other characters in Archigram? Because arguably Archigram wouldn't have been as successful as it was if it was only driven by David's sort of pessimism and nihilism.
Not. And he would be the
It
first
was
person
compensated by...
David would be the first person to tell you that it was not him. That it was, Peter Cook, who was the one who made them do it. The one who made them, do the drawing and made them staple it together and made them get it out there. And in a way, to compare the two, Peter Cook is the Malcolm McLaren of Archigram. And, whether other characters in the Archigram who are on the sort of green camp might be Mike Webb and Warren Chalk, I think, who were much more interested in these diffuse ideas rather than super amazing pictures of big things that walked around, which was a very sort of techno fetishist side of Archigram. So in a sense, you can see within both of them, there's this struggle between a few things. One is the person who thinks they're organising it, and let's say in the Sex Pistols, a person who feels that actually they are the authentic version of it, which is the Johnny Rotten, Malcolm McLaren struggle. And I guess that is also present within Archigram in a slightly less antagonistic way, and slightly less clear as well, but a certain kind of opposition within the body itself. But I think there's also a battle with the external identity, like what people thought of Archigram must have been, they must be so bored of saying, oh no, we didn't take lots of LSD, no, we didn't, smoke joints all the time and like then do a crazy drawing. Like they were just like quite serious architects doing their work, in a sense that like the external view of a quite idiosyncratic group, which we also probably experienced at FAT, where we were endlessly described as, oh, you're pranksters, you're also young, also just endlessly described as young, because when we started we were young, even though when we finished we were very old. But there's a certain kind of cliche in the way that you're seen by the world, which becomes like a thing you want to escape from, a thing you don't want to be. I'm not that. That's not me. And you want to walk off the stage and you want to say, ever get the feeling you've been cheated, even though you're not quite sure who's been cheated. Was it you that was cheated or was it everybody else? But somebody has been cheated in that kind of relationship with, I guess, the sort of external, the way the rest of the world sees a thing. And I think, but probably Archigram and the Sex Pistols, it's such a small world, it's like 5 or 6 people and an amazing amount of interest. One of the great things David says about the Archigram archive is they should have set fire to it. Like they should have burnt it, because that would have been in the spirit of Archigram in the first place, rather than turning it to try and sort of monetize it as a important cultural kind of archive. And I think that's partly to do with like, well, what do you do with your with your career? How do you stop it becoming atrophied as a kind of cliche of what you were, or what you represented, or what you are? And maybe setting fire to it is the right thing to do, or walking away from it, or retiring. These are all gestures about like trying to maintain perhaps an original, authentic voice or spirit within that body of work which you've created.
Just to go back to your beginnings of as FAT. So just the name, fashion, architecture, taste, a departure from the standard. I mean, either an architecture firm would be a single author or a list of names, right? So Skidmore, Owings, Merrill, etc. So when you decided that you, Sean, Charles, is that 3 of you at the beginning, right?
No, at the beginning it was like a cast of hundreds, and certainly no idea that it would be an architecture office whatsoever. It was, in the words we used at the time, a loose collective, which in the early to mid 90s was like, that's how, if you had any pretension to anything, it was a loose collective. If you were, it applied if you were graphic designers or a sound system or whatever you might do, loose collective. Nobody would know who's in charge of what. They wouldn't really have a...
Sounds a bit 60s.
No, you know what it was? People used to describe it, they said, well, this is the sort of combination of punk and Thatcherism. This is Thatcher's children who'd grown up and they were all going to be like somehow taking the spirit of punk, which is you can photocopy a fanzine and give it away, or you can get up on stage only knowing 3 chords, but with the entrepreneurial drive that had been instilled in them by Margaret Thatcher. And this was what framed the kind of, or was the myth, the scene told itself at that time. And to some extent, I think it's probably true that it is that, growing up with this sort of weird myth of the Sex Pistols and punk, even though none of us had, experienced it firsthand. But had been told that story so many times through forms of media, and strangely a kind of very right-wing idea of like getting on your bike and doing it. Sort of Norman Tebbit and Malcolm McLaren on either shoulder, maybe talking to us.
So what was the first FAT thing?
The first FAT projects were not buildings; they were sort of big art interventions, let's say. They were kind of urban art projects They used things like business cards, where we'd commission 250 artists to make business cards which would be dispensed from different places in a very complicated system of collecting them, which all had a kind of idea of how it would destroy the art market. We did things which now seem quite quaint, like using the sites in advertising in bus shelters, the advertising sites in bus shelters, as the site for art as well. With, again, the idea that suddenly if you take art out of the gallery, you then challenge not only the artist but also the spectator, but also transform this like totally ordinary activity within the city to change the sort of relationships between spectator and art object and ideas of value and so on. So none of them actually had an architectural form, like they didn't have walls or roofs or windows or budgets or clients sometimes, the things which you normally need to have if you want an architecture career. But we thought they had a very strong idea about what architecture might be, that actually architecture, like, you know, in a sense, a bit like David Greene was saying, like, architecture is not about buildings, you know, in a sense, you know, buildings might be where architecture goes to die, in a sense. It's the most dead form of architectural thinking. Actually, there might be other ways to think about it. So it becomes more transactional, becomes more social, or it becomes more ephemeral. And so those are the sorts of origins of FAT. And it, only much later, after a couple of years, did it really start to do any things which you might think of as properly architectural. And actually much, much later, before a building appeared. But in that time, all of that early loose collectiveness had fallen apart and had become an office. So we had to format our own careers in order to become, to allow ourselves to practice, to allow clients to hire us, because they couldn't hire a loose collective, because loose collectives don't have indemnity insurance. It's too unhip, man.
And just before I open it up to you guys, if you've got any questions or comments, would it be fair to say that the choices that you've made of your career formats reflect the fact, Sam, in particular, that you guys, you know, that FAT decided to call it a day recently. So the mythology of endings and new beginnings. Yeah. So if I'd asked you this, I don't know, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, would you have picked the same two characters, or is this something because it's live and it's kind of raw and it's happening now in your life?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you'd asked me a couple of years ago, it would have been like Norman Foster and Philip Johnson. No, it's totally live, and I think
that's what everyone in this room is thinking.
But it is really interesting, like ending a part of your career, and it was a weird decision, and it was a decision which isn't a very architectural firm type decision. Like, we didn't die, we didn't go bust, we weren't bought by someone else. We broke up in the manner of, you know, like, in the manner of this, really. So, yeah, I think that was...
Did that become... Sorry, and I put this image up because in a way this is your last...
Yeah.
This is the last FAT project.
Yeah.
And perhaps the most fetishistically architectural thing. But is this the last FAT project, or is the calling of your ending the last FAT project?
Well, the good thing about like staging your own death is that you can stage it over and over again. And of course, we know, like, you know, we thought we were breaking up in the same way that, you know, a band breaks up. And of course, we all know now that when a band breaks up, they'll be back next year. You know, this is the last time we'll ever.
Or in 20 years' time when their pension
like,
runs out.
One more song.
Yeah, but it's so quick now. You know, it's like how quickly Blur reform, like every couple of weeks, pretty much. And it's like it's almost like, oh, I forgot you broke up. You know, it's like, so I think like staging your death is about like controlling your destiny. Like death doesn't have to be a fate which happens to you. It might be something which you can theatrically stage. So, a rock and roll suicide might be different to professional suicide, but the design of your demise can become the way of keeping the real projects for us FAT alive, and it allows us to maintain that rather than critics or journalists or whoever else, because we can always come back as a sort of zombie, and like Freddy Krueger, we will never we will still be around for a long time. So I think that is quite important. Yeah, the last work is actually the demise. Yeah.
What's happening to the archive? You gonna burn it?
Good idea. Archives these days are so weird. They're like, it's like
it's a hard drive
disk like that.
Well, it's a zip drive probably from
Exactly.
1998. SideQuest. No one can read anyway.
And are there any questions or comments from? If not, then I'm gonna, Martino, I wonder whether. I find it interesting that, like you said at the beginning, that until I'd asked you this, you hadn't really thought that you had a career necessarily at such, and that's also how you sort of described it at the beginning. That it's a series of things that one does, perhaps in a kind of perpetual present, and then after a certain amount of time that's elapsed, you realise, well, maybe there was some kind of logic or illogic, but given that there are many, many more years of your professional life to come, let's hope, well. Unless you get run over by David Greene. Are you? There's this notion. I think, like Sam said, that I think one of the reasons that FAT broke up was this kind of the stiflingness of professionalism. Of being an office with all that kind of, which in a way it's the opposite of what we think of being like in a punk band or something. But do you feel that as your career has developed and has got kind of more successful, that you also you're obliged to that kind of professionalism, or is that something that you also managed to regulate as part of your environment?
No, it's something I think more and more, and maybe the idea of this career, once you think about you have a career, maybe the career is actually over.
It's over.
In a way. Once you're conscious about something, then it kind of...
I apologize, your career is over, I'm sorry.
No, not in a bad way. It's not a bad way, it just means you start thinking about, okay, what have you done, what have you achieved, and where is it going, and you kind of lose innocence in a way of doing a work.
But do you also think you lose the ability to, you lose a certain kind of freedom that you can't go, oh my God, what happens if I just stick that with this? Because you think, how does this fit with my own narrative of like what work we've done and what should come next? And that, as soon as you become too self-aware of having a career, you kind of, and I think this was, you then get a sort of certain kind of stage fright, I suppose.
Yeah, so for me, in my practice, I employ people, and be very busy the last year, and you have to take more people on, and at the moment I'm exactly at this point where I'm thinking actually when I employ less people, not because they're not doing the work, or I don't want to be responsible to not for their life. I don't want to be a people manager. I want to do creative things. I want to manage. You have to do this, and this, and check that everyone's doing their job. So yes, it's kind of keeping a balance between having enough people that you can do projects a certain size, and you can actually have time and fun doing that with people, but not too big that it actually becomes a burden. And that's a fine line in a way.
That's interesting. It reminds me of someone. It was an architect. She had a practice in New York, and they decided that the maximum they would only ever have 6 projects, maximum, and that allowed them to stay a certain size because they didn't want to basically get so big. So like Norman Foster is an industrial complex, right? Like and work has to work like an industrial complex, and the bigger something gets, as we know, there's a kind of diseconomy of creative scale There's economies of business scale, but diseconomies of creative scale. And again, that's something often you only find out once it's happened to you. And then it's, well, either I run with it and I keep growing, but I'm basically a kind of business manager. Or you strip it back, you fire everyone, and So
no, I think there's, for me at least, there can be a balance, can be found, and I mean, I know this is first when we always cook at lunchtime, for everyone, and we eat together, and suddenly you're 10, 12 people around the table. Some of them, kind of temporary or kind of freelance, stuff. But you're like, hold on a second, I gotta cook pots like this. Something's not right.
You need a bigger pan.
And take more time cooking in the morning than actually doing any work. So that's when you suddenly realize, okay, what's the next step? So okay, I'm cooking today. Tomorrow, no, he's busy. I can't, get him to cook because he's doing this project. So no, I don't want to. You become this.
You go to prep.
You go to prep, like
maybe that's the reason.
That's the reason. It's like you're like, okay, well now I have to go out and do this. Like I have to sacrifice the things I actually really like to spend lunch with my people in the studio and talk about anything else than work probably. So I guess it's about the balance, and but also for me, I've been going since 8 years to New Zealand for at least 1 or 2 months every year. And that's my kind of my kind of, not suicide in a way, but my kind of time
stepping
away.
out.
Stepping out. The studio still continues. I'm in contact with them. I know what's going on, but I do other things. I work with some crazy potters there, or I don't know. Still kind of work, but it's a very different work. It's nothing to do with what I do in the studio. And I think that keeps me somehow also interested in doing that, rather than going like, okay, well, every month is the same. I just have different clients. And I think you have to keep yourself this kind of free zones and this kind of time off to do other things in life.
Great. As we come careering towards the end, one last question for both of you. You've just got in a time machine. You've gone back 20 years. You're sitting down there, and you have to give yourself a career advice. One piece of career advice from each of you to your former selves who happen to be sitting here. Would you? And for a start, would you want advice when 20 years ago?
It wouldn't probably, I don't know. I would have probably listened to it.
And then ignore it.
Probably the opposite. But it would have come back in one way or another later on. Maybe he was right. Maybe he was right, or she was right.
Is there one thing that you would share?
I would definitely give them like this weekend's lottery numbers. I do think that even more now than I thought at the time is that actually a career is not a real thing. A career is a sort of fiction, and that you can make it up in the way that because I think that is what my experience of what happened. It was a series of random things, but there was a sort of idea of there was a necessary myth, a necessary fiction in order for them to happen in the first place, but also for them to make sense. So I'd say, don't have a career, but make one up. I think that would be to believe in the fictional nature of careers.
Martino?
I think for me it's probably more about, it's not one single thing that you're going to find that's going to change your life. It's a lot of small things that change your life. So it's not the one thing, big thing that you need to look for in life, in your career. It's a lot of small things you do. In that way I would say, try a lot of different things. Try a lot of different things, do a lot of different jobs, whatever they are. In each one of them you learn something more about yourself and about what you don't want to do. Because that's something I think one reason made me kind of quit what I was doing at 14 at one point. I was like, I really don't want to, I want to do this, but not that way. So understanding what you don't want to do in life is as important as understanding what you want to do. So therefore, the more things you try out and you go like, okay, it's okay, I learned something, but it's not quite mine. I think those are really experiences, I think, what you don't want to do rather than oh, I have this answer. I should feel it what I want to do. It has to be should be in the air. No, it's what you don't want to do. And eventually you go like, yes, of course, that's what I'm doing. So it's like, it's not a single thing. It's a lot of different things together. Try things out. Nothing's going to happen. If anything, you learn something, earn some money, meet some people. And yeah.
Fantastic. Will you please join me in thanking Martino Gamper and Sanjay? And thanks all for coming. So the next format is next Wednesday, and we have the fantastic graphic designer Irma Boom, who've done some of the most beautiful books over the last 20 years, and the curator, writer, and man who never sleeps, Hans-Ulrich Obrist. So that's next Wednesday. Hope to see you then. Thanks. Bye.